Good morning, dear friends. Allow me to welcome you with much gratitude for allowing me to share these reflections with you. I am very happy to have you present in this conference, and I look forward to being enriched by your comments and by your questions. We're going to talk about two very important and seminal theologians whose theology, thought radically influenced the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. First, I would like to say, well, again, thank you to all of you. I would like to thank my colleagues at the Pedro Arrupe Jesuit Institute, the Instituto Jesuita Pedro Arrupe, to its director, Joaquin Perez, without whom these conferences could not be celebrated, and to my colleagues, Alfredo and Margarita Romagosa, and my wife, Elena, who have done a literally titanic job of handling the logistics, doing the revisions, proof revisions of the PowerPoint, and other things that I could not do. So I'm very grateful to them. And so allow me to begin my reflections with Rahner. He's the senior of the two, born in 1904. Ratzinger was born in 1927. And they were friends, actually, even though their theologies at some point in time, as we will see later, parted ways. Some years ago, the Dominican theologian Jean-Pierre Torrel published a two-volume work of introduction to the thought of Thomas Aquinas. It still remains a classic, and for many people, the best introduction to the theology and to the life of the great common doctor, 13th century common doctor of the church. The first volume dealt with Thomas Aquinas' life and works. The second one was titled Thomas Aquinas, Master of Spirituality. The first time I read that, I was intrigued. I asked myself, shouldn't it read Thomas Aquinas, Master of Theology? And then upon reading it, Torrel answered my own question, clarified my own bewilderment. He said, in Thomas Aquinas, his academic, rigorous, not always easy to understand theological language flows like a river from its wellspring, from his mysticism, from his spirituality. Thomas was a true mystic, a master of spirituality, and that's why he was a master of theology. Well, the same thing applies, mutatis mutandis, to Karl Rahner. He was a great theologian, an academic, rigorous, and like Thomas Aquinas, not always easy to understand author and thinker, but everything he ever wrote or said, flowed very naturally and very smoothly and very mystically, if you will, from his spirituality. A Jesuit friend of mine, may he rest in peace, whose memory I remember with gratitude, Father Francisco Perez Lerena, you see his name there in the slide, we call him Paquito. He was studying at Innsbruck, at the University of Innsbruck in Austria, when Rahner was a faculty member there. He shared many stories about Rahner with me. And he said on an everyday basis, Rahner was a down-to-earth guy, a common, affable, gentle, smiling, a good-humored person who could laugh at a joke with the best of them and so on. There you see his image and you see his photo in the slide and so on. However, whenever a photographer approached him to take a photo for the back cover of a book of his soon to be published or for an upcoming academic event, then he went back to his professorial countenance and so on. No serious, self-respecting German theologian, German Jesuit theologian particularly, would be caught dead, smiling in a photo in the back cover of a scholarly book. I will not dwell long in the details of his life in the biographical précis. I will just, share with you the main points, those who, to some extent, or to a great extent, define his development as a theologian and as a professor. Born on March the 5th, 1904, in Freiburg am Breisgau, right in the heart of the Black Forest in Germany, a very Catholic region of the country. He entered the Society of Jesus in 1922 at the age of 18, part of the Ratio Studiorum, that is the program of studies that Jesuits are required to pursue, involves 2 or 3 years of studying philosophy. Rahner was sent to the Philosophate in Pullach, south of Munich. There, he had a decisive encounter, if you will, with Joseph Marichal, not a personal one, I mean, but with the works of Joseph Marichal, the Belgian Jesuit philosopher, and his 5-volume work, Le Point du Départ de la Métaphysique, the point of departure of metaphysics, which he will always refer to as the most decisive influence in my philosophy, that is to say, in the philosophical foundations of my theology. There, Marichal, as we will see later, developed the notion of the transcendental philosophy, that is to say, in every single act of loving, of knowing, of meeting someone, of reading a book, I mean, we are driven, see, towards the absolute meaning, absolute being, and so on, whom we call God. So every human act of knowing and loving is made possible actually by our dynamics, inner dynamics towards God. In 1932, Cardinal Michael von Faulhaber ordained him to the priesthood. His talents were, intellectual talents were in evidence from the early beginning. They were in evidence, very much in evidence from the start. And his intellectual capacity, in a sense, moved his superior, the provincial Jesuit. His talents were in evidence. His intellectual talents were in evidence from the very beginning. His capacity for studies, for thinking and research and so on, prompted his superior, the provincial of the northern German Jesuit province, to send him to do doctoral studies, PhD studies at the University of Freiburg. There held forth, see, the most important, or at least the most popular and the most remarkable philosopher in Germany at the time, Martin Heidegger. And it was not just the contents of Heidegger's very involved and very profound philosophy that drew students to him like a magnet. It was Heidegger was teaching a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching reality, of approaching the philosophical criteria for understanding reality. And this was actually making waves in the German philosophical and intellectual community as a whole. However, as a Jesuit, as a Catholic priest, Rahner was required by canon law to do his studies, see, under the direction of another priest. In this case, Martin Honecker, not to be confused with Martin Heidegger. Honecker was an old school, and if you will, if I may use the expression, old-fashioned philosopher, beholden to neo-scholastic, propositional, static, and somewhat boring philosophy and so on. He didn't like Martin Heidegger at all. He didn't like the fact that Rahner was taking seminars, doctoral seminars with Heidegger and presenting papers. It was very much liked and appreciated by the great German master, by Heidegger and so on. So when Rahner sat down to defend his doctoral dissertation called Spirit in the World, we owe a good deal to both Joseph Marichal, the Belgian Jesuit whom I mentioned before, and to Martin Heidegger. Honecker rejected it. So see, I always took comfort from the fact on my way to my own PhD dissertation that the great Karl Rahner, arguably the most mentioned and quoted and most important Catholic theologian of the 20th century, see, flunked his PhD dissertation. I didn't mind, so maybe that's why I didn't become a great theologian and so on. But then his superior, the provincial of the northern German Jesuit province, sent him to Innsbruck, to the University of Innsbruck, to pursue a doctoral degree in theology. Okay, so you're not going to be a professor of philosophy. You're going to be a theologian. And on December of 1936, he received his degree. He was awarded his degree as doctor in theology. Actually, he began teaching even before he received his doctoral degree at Innsbruck, which he would continue to do until 1939, when the Nazi regime, the Nazi German regime, closed the Theologate. I mean, the Nazis, as you know, annexed Austria. The Anschluss took place on March 12th of 1938, and Vatican II came about in the 1940s. During the war, Rahner did pastoral work in parishes and so on. He also did some work at the Pastoral Institute at the University of Innsbruck. And then came the period, the post-war period, and then came Pope John the 23rd, who in 1959 announced his intention to summon a new ecumenical council at the Vatican. Karl Rahner was appointed, let me bring this down so I myself can read it, the Eperitus, a Latin word that means an expert, a theological advisor to Cardinal Mark Koenig of Vienna. All the bishops, or most of the bishops, participating at Vatican II, especially the ordinary bishops, brought along their own theological experts to guide them through these theological debates and discussions, and especially to help them participate in the writing and redaction of the conciliar documents. Halfway through the council in 1964, the Romano Guardini, the Italian-German preeminent pre-conciliar theologian, a forerunner of Vatican II, announced his retirement from the chair of philosophy of religion and Christian cosmovision at the University of Munich. Rahner was appointed to succeed him. On April the 1st, but allow me to go back for a second. In Munich, though, Rahner felt, and he truly was under suspicion. His theology was already, he already published extensively in the late 40s and through the 1950s. And he was known as a theologian who, again, following his master, Martin Heidegger, dared to think in new fashion, in new ways. He dared to think of new horizons for theology. A theology always at the service of the church, not a theology for a purely academic purpose and so on. And he was looking ahead, far ahead, into the new forms and ways of the church, of Christology, of systematic theology, and so on and so forth. That brought him under suspicion. So he was not allowed, while he was at Munich, to direct doctoral dissertations in theology, only in philosophy. Rahner didn't like that, so in 1967, he was reassigned to University of Münster as professor of dogmatic theology and the history of dogma, where he became an emeritus in September of 1971. A few years later, he published the first edition of what has come to be known as his own Summa, Thomas Aquinas' master work, the Summa Theologiae. Rahner's Summa was a one-volume work, which he titled Grundkurs des Glaubens, Einleitung den Begriff des Christentums, Foundations of Christian Faith and Introduction to the Concept of Christianity. He continued as an emeritus, as a retired professor, to travel, to publish, to lecture extensively. Altogether, Rahner authored or co-authored, edited or co-edited over 4,000 published works. A remarkable achievement. In 1981, he returned to Innsbruck, a place he always loved dearly, where he died peacefully on the night of March 29th to March 30th of 1984. Let us look at the influences of Karl Rahner's thought. First of all, Rahner was not a biblical scholar, but he had a sound and fundamental, theological, fundamental theological command of the scriptures and their meaning. He had, as one friend of his described it, a despotic command of the tradition of theology and dogma of the church. He could quote any ecumenical council and the doctrines that it defined or it dealt with at the drop of a pin. As a Jesuit, he had entered the Society of Jesus at age 18. Ignatius of Loyola will always remain, his main spiritual influence. The mysticism of everyday life that we will see in detail later. Ignatius's Christocentric and Trinitarian mysticism as defined particularly in the spiritual exercises. The Sucipe prayer, Sucipe, receive, take Lord and receive all my memory, my intelligence, and all my will, let me see, how does it go? My intelligence, my memory, and my will, all that I own and possess, you gave it to me, O Lord, to you I return them. Do with them whatever you please. It's the great prayer of Ignatius at the end of the exercises. From Thomas Aquinas, he learned the depths, the mystical depths of Thomas's Trinitarian theology and Thomas's wonderful dynamics of grace, the God's gracious self-bestowal upon human history, upon human beings. In a sense, his failed doctoral dissertation, which, by the way, was the first important book that he later published, Spirit in the World, to great acclaim, was really on Thomas Aquinas's philosophy and theology of knowledge. Uh, Dictated by God's grace and so on. Of Thomas Aquinas, he said, Thomas is a mystic, a key word, who worships that mystery which is beyond all possible expressions. See, Thomas knows well that authentic theology, real theology, academic theology, serves only one purpose: to demand each person to live the safe confines of his own security. For our own security, that's what true theology does. Get out of that security and go there where he cannot grasp or only be grasped, into the awesome mystery of, see, God's silence. Let me pause here. Several key words that will appear later in the presentation. They're uh, they're very key, very crucial to understand Ranner's theology, Ranner's fundamental theology. God as holy mystery of love, God as incomprehensible love, God as the silent mystery of love, God as the that which is the unnamed silence, and on and on and on. That kind of language defines the core of Ranner's theology of God, or if you will, his fundamental theology. Two other people here were crucial in the development of Ranner's philosophy and theology. Here, in particular, two great philosophers: Joseph Marechal, a Belgian Jesuit. See, he developed the approach to transcendental Thomism, but that says simply that rather complex, rubric says the dynamics of knowledge and love, see, as the transcendental reality of the human person. In fact, both Marechal and Ranner will draw from Thomas Aquinas's uh, work of youth, disputed questions on truth, or simply known as on truth. In question 22, article 2 of that work, Thomas Aquinas says, in every act of knowledge, not necessarily religious knowledge, any kind of knowledge, secular or religious, the cognitive subject, the person who knows God implicitly in whatever is known. And then he adds from St. Augustine, whatever can love loves God implicitly, meaning that when I meet someone new, when I read a book I haven't read before, or reread a book, and so on, when I encounter reality, my ability, see, my capacity to know and to love that reality, see, is defined and driven, see, by that, uh, by that ultimately dynamics, see, that every single human being, Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Hindu, Muslim, agnostic, atheist, has towards God. We are defined as a drive, as a dynamic impulse towards God. And Marichal plays on that and developed his transcendental Thomism out of that. He studied under Martin Heidegger, and he always said in 5 interviews he gave throughout the course of his life where he mentioned Heidegger, it wasn't so much the contents of Heidegger's theology, but he said, Heidegger taught me a new way of thinking from a historical point of view, thinking historically. By the way, that is one of the key theological themes of the Second Vatican Council. See, restoring theology to historical context. There is no perennial theology eviscerated from history at all. All dogma, doctrine, theology, they all happen within history, and they have to respond to historical changes and dynamics. Heidegger taught him that. And look what he says there in that slide at the bottom, in quotation marks, in parentheses. Heidegger taught me a new way of thinking, the only professor for whom I developed the respect that a disciple has for a great master. Wow. I mean, they, after Ranner finished his theological studies, they met only once in Vienna, Austria, where they coincided and they had a conversation, the contents of which we don't know. Ranner was, Ranner is known today by his readers, by his intellectual and theological followers, especially his spiritual followers. By his great and beloved, the North American disciple, the Jesuit Harvey Egan, one of the foremost experts in mystical theology, as a mystic. Ranner was first and foremost a mystic, and from his mysticism there will flow his often complicated, rigorously academic theology. One of Ranner's best known quotes, it appears in volumes 7 and 20 of his theological investigations. the English translation of his Schriften zur Theologie. The Christian of the future will be a mystic. And then he adds, I omitted that, that is someone who has experienced God or will be nothing at all. He says, because society is a secular society. Society no longer gives us the Christian, the explicitly Christian props upon whom we can lean. Now we will be either Christians convinced of our Christianity. That is to say, people who experience God, mystics, therefore, will be nothing at all. Of St. Ignatius, he said often, and I quote, more and better than a theologian was he. His spirituality offers an agenda for theology today. We're talking about, a Spanish mystic, the founder of the Society of Jesus, who lived from 1491 to 1556, who never wrote a book on philosophy or theology. He's known for his spiritual exercises, for his spiritual journal, and so on and so forth. 3 weeks before he died, Ranner was interviewed by a Spanish theologian, a professor at the University of Valencia, who had done his PhD under Ranner, and that interview has been published in several places. And he was asked, "What do you hope for, Father Ranner? You just turned 80. What do you hope for?" And he said, "What do I hope for? I can only say for the eternity and mercy of God. And I hope to pray with Ignatius of Loyola the Suchitmi prayer, take, Lord, and receive all my intelligence, my memory, my liberty, and all my will." That is the truth. I misquoted it the first time. Take, Lord, and receive all my intelligence, my memory, my liberty, and all my will. See, all that I own and possess, you gave them to me, O Lord. To you I return them. Do with them whatever you please. Give me only your love and grace, that is sufficient. And with Teresa of Avila, Teresa de Jesus, let nothing disturb you. See, only God matters, and so on. And then he added something that defines the soul, the mystical soul of this great and rigorously academic theologian. These two prayers, he said, are more than words. They are a whole way of living. He says, Ignatius' emphasis on the subject, on interiority, the subjective effort of self-reflection, of assuming responsibility and salvation, they constitute him as the first modern man par excellence. Modernity is characterized by those approaches, those themes. The same has been said of Martin Luther, but Luther's suspicious of human nature, in a sense, in my opinion, somewhat disqualifies him from that. Of the spiritual exercises, Elena, my always solicitous wife, is bringing me a bottle of water. Thank you. God will reward you by giving at some point in time a normal husband. Okay, it's the spiritual exercises, he says, are a form of religiosity antecedent, that is prior to theological reflection, fundamentally more spontaneous than theology, wiser and more experienced than the wisdom of scholars. Ranner published a book on the exercises, which I will quote later, and where this quote is pretty much taken from. He was a teacher of prayer, and here you have a list of books. Since Joaquin will place this on YouTube and so on, where you can see it later, I will not dwell too long in this. Very popular is his posthumously published book, Prayers for a Lifetime. A key and wonderful little book, Encounters with Silence. The Great Church Year, also published after his death, a collection of his sermons for the liturgical year. Then his meditations on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. He published a book on Mary, the Mother of the Lord. Now, we come to what is one of the key, maybe we could say the key contribution, the key topic and theme that lies at the heart of Ranner's thought, his theology, his academic rigorous theology, as it flows as mystical spirituality, and which in a sense, as we will see at the end of this whole presentation, make Ranner a supremely pastoral theologian. Here I will begin by sharing with you the contents, the essence of the mysticism of everyday life. Later, we will see the foundations. Normally, logic will require the very opposite. First, you begin with the foundations, what lies at the bottom of the mysticism of everyday life, and then you talk about the essence. I'm reversing the order because I want to put across from the very beginning Ranner's awesome, delightful, see, mystical thoughts on this. He says, the decisive moment in our lives happens when all the supports in my life fail. My friends, my own ideas sometimes, my my communities of support, and so on. In other words, when I'm left dangling in the air, then we have to ask ourselves whether that inescapable darkness, typical runner language, darkness, that envelops my life is absolute absurdity or a blessed and holy night. Is that dark night of the soul? Albert Camus, the French writer on philosophy and Nobel laureate of 1957, he is normally known as an existentialist philosopher. He always said, "Don't call me existentialist, call me an absurdist. My philosophy is a philosophy of the absurd. See, human life is an absurdity. It's absurd. Like the myth of Sisyphus, the Greek, the Greek titan that actually really played a bad joke on Zeus and ridiculed Zeus, there to confront him, was condemned to push a rock up the slope of a mountain. And when he reached the summit, the rock will come down and Sisyphus will have to repeat the operation on from all eternity. Camus says that's human life, absurdity. Ranner says, oh no, it may be a blessed and holy night. Who is the mystic of everyday life? Ranner says, will you find it there when we have someone who can forgive, even though he receives no reward from it? Who is the mystic of everyday life? There we have someone who is totally alone, who realizes that all the positive elements in his life are but pale shadows. What we think really matters, see, is really valuable, that I devote my life for. No, they are pale shadows, see, that we encounter in our pilgrimage towards God. He said, but that person does not flee from such loneliness, rather regards it as the ultimate hope. Wow, only a mystic could say that. In all of this, he says, where is God? God is there where the leap into the darkness of death is accepted as the beginning of his eternal promise. There where we dare to pray in silent darkness, and yet we know that our prayer is heard, even though, and this is key, even though we receive no reasonable answer. God is not answering my prayer. God is silent to my prayer yet. See, we find God. See, we define ourselves as mystics of everyday life. See, when we can pray in that silent darkness. Let me just, repeat this, and you will hear me reiterating this over the course of the presentation several times. It is important, at the risk of sounding repetition. What Ranner is saying here does not refer only to Catholics or Protestants or Jews, Hindus or Muslims, but also to agnostics and atheists. We will see that later in more detail. God is there where we accept our despair, and we all face moments of despair, as worthy of trust. There where a person surrenders and entrusts all his knowledge and questions to the silent and total inclusive mystery. Remember what I said just a few minutes ago? This is key to understand Ranner's language. God is holy mystery of love. God is silent mystery. God is the silent, unnamed mystery, see, that becomes the foundation and the structure of my life. The silent and total inclusive mystery, which we love more than all our individual fragments of knowledge. So here we come upon a key definition, a key theme of Ranner. There will be several of these along the way. Fundamental option, the supernatural existential, the anonymous Christian. But please don't run away, don't turn off your computers. We will explain them. They may seem like a display of verboria, actually. Like overly verbose themes, but they are tremendously fascinating and directly pastoral and relevant to us. What is the fundamental option? It is that or he who defines our personal mysticism, who determines our decisions, who kindles the fire in our hearts, who moves our life from sunrise to sunset. See, Father Pedro Arrupe, actually, there's a prayer attributed to Father Pedro Arrupe, who was the prepositus of the Society of Jesus, the general of the Society of Jesus, from 1965 to 1992, and that says the fundamental option, I mean, our basic love, it is that which wakes me up in the morning looking ahead at the day that lies in front of me, that which decides what I will read and do in my evenings, that will prompt and define whom I love and what I love. It is that in other words, that drives my life forwards, that decides, see, all my options and so on. Again, whenever there is a radical self-surrender, an absolute yielding of everything, a surrender to the mystery that embraces all life, again, mystery, silence, and so on, there is the spirit of the crucified and risen Christ, the source of all mysticism. The mystic of everyday life is the one who with difficulty, mind you, difficulty, and without any clear evidence of success, plods away at the task of awakening in just a few men and women, just a few, not crowds of thousands. A few men and women, a small spark of faith, of hope, and of charity. Notice the underline text there, highlighted in blue. Without any clear evidence of success, I have to remind myself of that. That is a temptation that besets me personally time and again. What am I doing this for? There are mornings when I wake up just, eager to throw everything out of the window, and move to a Buddhist monastery in the Himalayas and leave everything behind. But no, Ranner says the mystic of everyday life is he or she who plods away without any clear evidence that you're succeeding, that this is actually having an impact, that you're changing things, see, and you are working with just a few men and women. Super. Ranner was known as the primary theologian of the Sacred Heart. Mind you, a caution here. We are not talking about Ranner collapsing or indulging into a pious devotion. Actually, he bases much of what he says on that encyclical by Pius XII of May the 15th of 1956, Haurietis Aquas, drawing water from the wells, the springs of drawing water from the well, which is a text from chapter 6 of the book of Isaiah. See, and Ranner develops in the whole theology of the word heart. Heart is a primary word. What is a primary word? It is a word that is always overflowing its immediate meaning, that in a sense defines itself. He gives us an example, the word mother. We know what we mean when we utter mother, and yet mother is always overflowing its immediate meaning and so on. In its biblical sense, we know that heart defines the whole human person. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, see, the Bashar is my mortal humanity, the Nefesh is my human spirit, the Ruah is the breath of God. Heart brings all of that together. In the New Testament, is the Soma, my body, the Psyche, psychology, my human spirit, the Pneuma, the Holy Spirit, and so on. See, the heart is the place of evolution, of intellect, of activity. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the word leb or lebeb is used 858 times. In the New Testament, cardia, cardiology, 157 times. Now, another yet Ranerian Ranerian word or expression typical of him, coined by him, the heart of Jesus, the real symbol of the self-surrender of the love and mercy of the Father in the person of his Son, alive in the Spirit. What is a real symbol? Ranner says, look at the sacraments, for instance. A symbol is, see, there is a difference between a symbol and a sign. I can drive along and see a sign that says dangerous curve ahead. Warning, careful, dangerous curve ahead. If I remove the sign, that place of the road doesn't cease to be dangerous. It will continue to be. But a symbol is different. A real symbol is that reality which is pregnant with, it is filled with, it communicates and it makes present what it symbolizes. For Ranner, the sacraments are real symbols. My body is a real symbol. I am not only my body, but my body conveys and makes present the totality of who I am. Real symbol. See? And then he says, only if we direct our gaze to the heart of Christ do we know what love is. What is love? The mystery of the world, the overcoming of the terrors which are in the world, that which unifies and embraces us. See, notice the highlighting in red, that which is realized only in its fullness when the one who loves makes a total surrender of everything. This is achieved when this love of Jesus, is pierced through and silently pours out his heart's blood into the futility of the world and thereby conquers it. No, notice the Paschal dimension of Ranner's theology. I mean, the incarnation for him was the mystery of mysteries. There is that Paschal dimension, the futility of the world, conquering the terrors of the world. There, Christ is present, praying as we saw in a previous slide. See, knowing that we are here and yet we don't have any clear evidence of that, and so on. Ranner had a typical Ignatian Jesuit devotion to Mary that is profound and sober. Look at the highlighted text in blue. Such is Mary, the tender humility, the splendor of her grace, of her great spirit, her unlimited surrender unto God, everything that filled her soul when she said, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord." That self-surrender of Mary was key for Ranner. It's the same self-surrender we are called to have. All of this is ever present and ever new. The simple greatness of her life, the sacrifice of her son at the foot of the cross. Ranner wrote a book on Mary, the mother of the Lord, and Mary appears in several of his anthologies or collections of prayers. Now, let us talk about some very strange themes. Now we get into what one might call the, shall I term it the challenging part of Ranner's thought. Now we enter into the foundations of what we said before, the mysticism of everyday life. We have looked at the essence, the content, the phenomenology, if you will, the practice of the mysticism of everyday life. Let's look at the foundations. And I inverted the logical order deliberately, so the possible challenge of the foundations would not interfere with the beautiful text that we saw before. Now, here is the thing. God's self-communication to the human being. We are created when God communicates himself to us, and we are created, notice, he doesn't say as possessing, but as being. We are created as a capacity. I am a capacity, hunger and openness for absolute being and mystery. That is what we call God, if you will. That is for absolute grace. That is what Ranner calls the supernatural existential. Now, let us parse that definition. The supernatural existential is not an object, but that which defines me as human. In other words, I look for my deepest definition as human. Is it my cranial capacity, my reality as a rational being? All of those things are important. But what really defines me as human is the supernatural existential, that constitutive reality of who I am. And what is that constitutive reality? Is that I am, by definition, Christian and Jew, Hindu and Muslim, agnostic and atheist, all human beings who have ever existed, exist, and will ever exist. We are a drive, a dynamics, a yearning for the absolute being and mystery that defines my life, whom we in the Jewish Christian tradition call God. And now comes the problem Ranner had to confront. The theologians, those theologians rooted and trapped in the already obsolete neo-scholastic theology. Neo-scholastics they would say very, very directly, something is either grace or it is nature. It cannot be both. If it is grace, it's not part of our nature, human nature. If it is nature, of course, it is not grace. Ranner says we have to be careful with that. Because there we are dichotomizing. Looking at the human being as a dichotomy. The supernatural existential is supernatural because it is a gracious gift to all humans. It is existential because it is my deepest reality. It is what it means to be human. And Ranner, by the way, will say, and we will see that probably in the next slide, just because I give a gift to everyone, it doesn't make it less as a gift. Neo-scholastic would say, no, grace is given, by God gratuitously, graciously. It is not demanded. It is not merited. And Ranner says, I agree. But that grace is given to all. That grace of creation that makes me existential, if you will, naturally a pure, a radical, passionate, longing, yearning for God, for ultimate meaning. So Ranner says, look at this slide. There does not exist, nor has there ever existed, not even as a hypothesis, a purely natural person. Pure nature, that was a key term of New Scholastic theology. See, God creates us as pure nature, and then at a second moment, dumps upon us. See, lavishes upon us supernatural grace, elevating us to the supernatural order. Randy says that's wrong. Well, actually, the first guy to say that was the great Jesuit theologian, also present at Vatican II, Henri de Lubac. But Randy appropriates this and deepens this even more. There has never been a purely natural person, pure nature, marginal to grace. What makes a human being truly human, is that by God's gracious self-communication, each human being is, notice the capitalized is. It doesn't say human being has. Each human being is a hunger, a desire, a craving to know and to love God in each concrete act of her knowledge and will. See, that applies to the atheist who denies the existence of God, who in encountering, knowing a person or reading a new book and so on, knowing something new for him in reality, may not think of God and so on. But that knowledge, that concrete knowledge, is made possible by his or her drive towards infinite mystery, towards God. This is drawn directly from Thomas Aquinas's work De Veritate, written at around 1200 and 1258 or 59, 700 years earlier. Huh? What? We continue with the foundations of everyday life with this seemingly abstract but very pastoral and very wonderful and very mystical and spiritual theme, the supernatural existential. So that being the case, Reiner says that the human being is in his or her most intimate and deepest essence an homo mysticus. And again, forgive my repetitive mode here, my friends. Forgive my repetitiousness here. See, this applies to all human beings. That means that concrete human existence, by dint of being soaked, of being totally dripping, in the holy mystery of love that we call God, each and every human being, again, Christian, Jewish, etc., is called to a mystical experience that is an experience of incomprehensible love of the Trinitarian God. All human beings that have been, are, and will be, can be defined in a sense, in a way of life, as an homo mysticus. That reality, that experience is not confined to people like St. John of the Cross, Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa de Jesus, Teresa of Avila, Teresa of Lisieux, and so on. Now, rather appealing to the personalist philosopher, I'm thinking here of Martin Buber, of Gabriel Marcel, mystery. And Ranner is known. Books have been written on Ranner's theology of mystery. And I'm looking at one right now. James Basic's doctoral dissertation. On the theology of mystery, according to Ranner, is not a problem to be solved. It is our most intimate reality. We speak of the mysteries of the universe, a detective mystery. Who was the killer, who was the robber, or whatever. But those are problems, not mysteries. Mysteries that or he who communicates himself, gives himself to us as the most foundational reality of our lives, and soaks us with his grace. God is the ultimate mystery, holy mystery of love. In other words, to put it simply, mystery is not something that we can grasp in a definition, as we can do with a problem. Mystery is that or he, that person who grasps us. God is the mystery of silence, of incomprehensible darkness, who reveals himself as absolute light, life, and truth. Only a mystic could write something like that. But Ranner's theology, there have been many arguments published in books on Ranner and drawing from Ranner texts. The debate rages on. What is the key, the central, the decisive theme or topic of Ranner's theology and spirituality? Today, many will say it is grace, theology of grace, and in a manner of speaking, that is true. But Ranner was always careful, he was always careful to define, and Harvey Egan who knew him well. He did his doctoral dissertation under Ranner's direction in Münster when Ranner was teaching there in 1973. No, it is Christology. It is Christ. It is the mystery of the incarnation, to be more specific. That is and we'll see another student of Ranner, the Benedictine Chinese theologian Joseph Wong, whose doctoral dissertation I have here on my shelf. I mean, Logos symbol in the Christology of Karl Rahner argues the same point. Christology lies at the center of everything that Rahner says. That phrase that you see there, highlighted in yellow, I mean, it is a sort of a paraphrase, if you will, a bit of a paraphrase of Rahner's text. Christology is self-transcending anthropology. Anthropology is deficient Christology. Now, Sixto, you lost me totally. I mean, why do you have to quote? I mean, why do you have to quote this seemingly undecipherable, theological thing? But people, this is so simple. It means basically Christology is the understanding of the human being transcending itself towards its fullness. Rahner says, in the incarnation, in the incarnation, the Son of God brought the whole of humanity into its ultimate possibility. So Christology is anthropology, that is to say, the science of the human being, and so on, transcending itself into Christology. But if we look for the meaning of life only in anthropology, that becomes deficient Christology. Allow me to read you. That is best understood in the very clear text of the Second Vatican Council, the Constitution, Gaudium et Spes, Article 22. Allow me to read that. And that explains that yellow highlighted text. The Vatican II says in Gaudium et Spes, in reality, it is only in the mystery of the Word made flesh that the mystery of man, it's exclusive language, I know, but truly becomes clear. For Adam, the first man, was a type of him who was to come, Christ the Lord, Christ the new Adam. In the very revelation of the mystery of the Father and of his love, Christ the Lord reveals man, the human being, to himself and brings to light his most high calling. If I want to understand who I am, who I am as a human being, what I am, who I am, Christ is the ultimate revealer. And that text that I just read from Vatican II comes directly from Rahner's theology. He also had a hand in the drafting of the Constitution Gaudium et Spes. From the moment of the incarnation, Rahner says, we cannot speak of God at all without speaking of the human being. Why? Because in Jesus Christ, the immutable God became something vulnerable, mortal, human, existing, and history, by dint of the incarnation, the vulnerable, mortal, existing, and history of the Logos, the Word. In other words, human history, our own secular, if you will, secular human history, now becomes the history of God, the Son of God, who, as we confess in the Creed, is consubstantial with the Father. So, look at the text highlighted in red there. Human vulnerability and mortality, the capacity to suffer, the desperation of the Garden of Gethsemane, the cry from the cross quoting Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? They belong to God's own intimate, infinite reality. Now in the incarnation, God has assumed the totality of our own being, our joys and suffering, desperations and anguishes and so on. They belong to God, really and truly. When God wishes to be not God, now it doesn't say here, when God does not wish to be God, that is impossible. When God wishes to be not God, what God is not, the human being is created. So the incarnation of the Son of God is the highest case of the human person's realization. That contributes to that text of Gaudium et Spes that I just read. Rahner didn't write that much on the Trinity, although it is presupposed in everything that he wrote. He draws that from his own deep acquaintance with Ignatius's spirituality and the exercises. The Trinity is the center of St. Ignatius' spirituality. It is Trinitarian Christocentric mysticism, says Harvey Egan, one of Rahner's beloved disciples. In fact, Egan wrote a book called Ignatius Loyola Mystic, which is sort of the adaptation, if you will, the unfolding and development of his own doctoral dissertation on the Rahner of 1973. Ignatius of Loyola as a mystic and so on. But Renner says, today we don't pray in a Trinitarian fashion. We have lost Trinitarian consciousness. He says, if by a mere hypothesis, let's assume an impossibility, see, that Trinitarian theology were to be declared by the Pope as not a normative thing, as not essential to Christianity, again, a reductio ad absurdum, an absurdity. See, the great majority of the books on spirituality would not have to be altered or rewritten because they don't have Trinitarian consciousness. But for Ranner, there is a fundamental Trinitarian principle. The immanent Trinity. What is the immanent Trinity? It is God in himself. God the Father, from all eternity, begetting the Son, and in the mutual and infinite love, self-surrendering love between the Father and the Son, they breathe the Spirit. See, God in himself, the Trinity, as it functions, as it moves, the phenomenology, the dynamics of the Trinity in itself, that is the Trinity that we experience, the economic Trinity. God revealing himself to us through Jesus Christ, through his incarnation in Paschal mystery, activated and dynamized in the life of the Spirit. Now, we come to the second part of Ranner's theology and presentation. He wrote on the church, not as extensively perhaps as Ratzinger, but perhaps in a more foundational and more basic fashion. He says, Christianity is church. Therefore, it is inaccurate to say that Jesus founded the church as a politician could establish a new political party, because, quote, the church is nothing else but the further projection of the reality of Jesus in a space and time. It is Jesus, pursuing his ministry and his mission, if you will, see, in everyday history, see, in a space and time. An added quotation, the church is the continuation of the Jesus event and the sacrament of eschatological victory. What is eschatological? From the Greek eschatos, last, at the very end, the ultimate, the final victory, if you will. So, see, look at the last quotation highlighted in yellow in this slide. This found its way into the very first paragraph of the dogmatic constitution Lumen Gentium of Vatican II. The church is the sacrament of Christ, just as Christ is the sacrament of God. Vatican II, Lumen Gentium says that the church is the universal sacrament of salvation. That comes from Ranner. About ministry, see, now this is where Ranner found himself sometimes in controversy, not so much with Rome directly, but with, again, some of the neo-scholastic theologians, some of the theologians that still were faithful to the neo-scholastic tradition and so on. Ranner argues, and practically every single biblical scholar, today, even those who may be labeled conservative, will agree with this. The historical Jesus, neither established nor decreed as the 19th century and some 20th century and 21st century the scholastic theologians and their theology argued. He didn't establish directly the pontificate, the episcopacy, and the priesthood as they are understood today. Objection. What about Matthew 16, the 13 to 19? You are Peter, and upon this rock. Biblical scholars will tell you today that yes, Peter received a special commission, leadership of the group of 12. Here, Catholic and Protestants are in agreement. The disagreement comes on the part of our Christian brothers, non-Catholic Christian brothers and sisters, who do not recognize that the popes are successors of Peter in a direct line and so on. See, but Jesus didn't create the pontificate, the episcopacy, and the priesthood, see, or the diaconate for that matter, as they are understood today. What he did, he imparted, he suffused his spirit upon the community. See, a foundational charisma is capacity to evolve. Evolution is a key concept in Ranner. Evolution, something that many people, even today, have difficulties accepting. Sacraments, ministries, doctrines, and dogmas evolve. Oh, that's nothing new. St. John Henry Newman had already said that in the 19th century. In a book he published first as an Anglican and later as a Catholic, see, on the development of Christian doctrine. See, sacraments and ministries have their history of evolution. We know that by the 12th century, just to give you an example that is not listed there was still a dispute among the scholastic theologians as to how many sacraments were there. Are there 7? Or are there as many sacraments as created beings as St. Augustine had offered as a possibility, and so on. They evolve. They're guided by the Spirit, and they evolve in concrete forms in history. Ranner was very clear on lay ministries. The word lay does not mean profane in false distinction from the sacred. You have sacred ministries from the Pope down, Pope, bishops, priests, deacons, and so on. And then you have the lay ministers, those who are left behind to sweep away the rubble. Now, he says this is biblically and theologically indefensible. The Spirit offers us a church as a community, which is much more than an elite clergy and a passive laity. Look at the last paragraph. The charismatic element is therefore the primary and most proper characteristic of the church. This is what already had been said before. See, and rather to do justice where justice is due, takes it from that other great theologian of the Vatican II, the Dominican Yves Congar. Ranner says, look at this very closely. See, we go to Mass and we have a lay reader proclaiming the word of God. We have the lay choir director, the musicians, but then of course we are focused on the priest, the celebrant, the attending deacons, and so on. But Ranner says, lay ministers perform and have been doing so for years. A constitutive, the key word there is constitutive, essential ministry of the church. And the evidence of the New Testament in this is key, as Edward Skilevich has also acknowledged. You have to respect that evidence. The hierarchy of the church should acknowledge what is de facto reality. Lectors, musicians, hospital ministers, and others performing the same level of vocation as ordained ministers, quote unquote. Therefore, Ranner argued, and he met a lot of opposition and criticism by saying this: there should be an authentically sacramental form of ordination for those whom we call lay ministers. In other words, the readers, assuming a commitment to that ministry and so on, should be ordained, in a sense, to that ministry and so on. For Ranner's sacramental theology was key, and Jesus is the sacrament of the whole Trinitarian reality of God, the Church's universal sacrament of salvation. Ranner says that a sacrament is a real symbol, again, a reality that makes present and conveys what it symbolizes. Sacraments do not create or invent grace. Sacraments do not create or invent grace. They do not add new grace. They are real symbols of a world already drenched from the moment of creation in grace, drenched, soaked in grace. And grace is not something. Grace is, in its deepest form, the life of the Trinitarian God. Sacraments have evolved in history. Anyone who has taken any serious, academically competent basic course on sacraments, foundational course on sacrament, know this. The baptism, later confirmation, Eucharist and penance and so on have evolved in their forms and even in their contents. In this sense, it is not that theology is subordinated to history, but theology is answerable to history. Let's take baptism as an example. It is correct to say that in baptism we are immersed in the death of Christ and risen with him. As we'll read from Paul's text in Romans 6, which, by the way, is one of the mandatory texts read at the Paschal Vigil, at the Easter Vigil. Baptism defines us as Christians, but baptism does not create or establish an elite, a social club of the pure and the perfect. Now we come into another very controversial point of Ranner's theology, the anonymous Christian. It is very easy to understand, people. I'm sure we all have met friends, and we all have friends, good friends, maybe family members close to us, who are not in a strict sense believers, who are not in a strict sense, people beholden to Jesus, the church, or any particular religious form and so on, but who seeks, look at the text underlined or highlighted in blue. Every human being, those relatives or friends of ours that are not formally attached to any church or to any religious form or tradition, but who seek with openness, honesty, and courage, faithful to his or her duties, living in loving self-givenness to others. That mystery that defines him or her, without necessarily consciously knowing it, is an anonymous Christian. They may not call it God. Your atheistic or agnostic friend or close relative must not call it God, may not call it God, but if they live, if that relative of yours or if that acquaintance of yours lives a life of self-giveness, of love, see, of inquiring ultimately about where I come from, see, what is my what is my definition as a human being, see, what am I beholding to others, see, that person lives in a world immersed in grace, as all human beings have always been, has always been, see, seeking the mystery of his life, see, in his own tradition. Rather says, what is the good news for some Christians doesn't have to be bad news for others. No one is excluded from the offer of salvation. Then he says, the text highlighted in blue, the scandal of the gospel is that God's love is inclusive. That means all. Ranner did a bit of a political theology. It was, in a sense, Ranner's directly beloved disciple, the German theologian Johann Baptist Metz, see, who died just this last December at the age of 90. I mean, he's considered the founder of political theology, at least Catholic political theology in Germany, along with the Protestant Jürgen Moltmann and others. And they were more explicitly emphatic on the dangerous memory of Jesus, political commitment, the grace of political commitment, and so on. For Ranner, see, the whole idea is that that his theology was universal. The God of Christian tradition applies to speaks to the whole of humanity. So he says the commitment with justice and the common good is not a purely secular task. This is a key point. In a world immersed in grace, this commitment is not an indifferent action without a moral sign, like scratching my head or yawning and so on, or simply staying at home and reading and watching TV. See, and watching the Miami Dolphins lose yet another game and so on. For those of you who live north of Miami, pick your favorite team. What the Scholastic used to call an actus homini, an indifferent act. Rather, it's an action which involves the political commitment, the whole human person, intellect, will, affectivity. See, the foundation, the moral foundations, political commitment. See, it is a human act, an actus humanus, and so on. See, in other words, why? Because it is basically a search for the common good. It is basically a commitment to the common good. See, to the dignity, to affirm the dignity of the human person, and so on. Finally, Ranner spoke little but some about what about life in other systems, in other planetary or galactic systems. He said there might be, we cannot deny that. The issue is not whether there is intelligent life in other planetary or cosmic systems. It is what role will Jesus Christ play, his revelation and redemption, and so on and so forth. Do those people know the concept of sin, redemption? If they are rational, we have to say that in some way they seek the ultimate mystery of their lives. And from there, well, this is pretty much the end of my presentation.